I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up next on The Trade Guys, we'll talk EU regulatory landscape and U.S.-EU economic relations. Plus, we'll talk about something Bill is very excited about, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDD. All on the next episode of The Trade Guys. All right, boys, we're back, and Europe has been shaken up a little bit considering what happened at the Munich Security Conference, but business goes on, trade goes on. We want to talk about the EU regulatory landscape and the U.S.-EU economic relations. Scott, I want to start with you. What is the impending EU omnibus package, and what do we think might be included in it?
Well, that's a mystery. It has been announced, but the contents are thus far not been given any play in terms of their specifics. But here's the broad sweep of it. Europe is a very important, large, integrated economy. The single market, which was a 30-year-old project at this point, was really important to the advancement of trade and investment in Europe and the integration of Eastern Europe with the pre-war Western Europe. And there was a lot of work done on streamlining products and integrating the markets that now has turned into Europe being the first mover on all sorts of product and process regulation. Now, it's fine to be the first mover if somebody follows. And one of the problems Europe has had recently, as growth has become sluggish and as population dynamics have changed, is that they are regulating faster than any of the other markets with whom they compete in the global economy, including the United States. And so there's a challenge that was first presented in a white paper by Mario Draghi, former central banker, ECB president, showing the competitive gaps and the need for regulatory reform. And then out of the Davos meetings, the World Economic Forum conference most recently, there were a number of promises made by leadership of the European Commission for regulatory reform. But that's what this omnibus is, and we haven't seen it yet. But one of the things I've noticed, being a business guy who came to Washington, is almost no Washington person, and it's probably true in Brussels as well, understands the concepts of diminishing returns or opportunity cost. Those are key concepts in business, but regulators will never admit that getting the next 1% after you've gotten to 90 is the least bit difficult. They just want to cruise ahead. So standards tend to get more constraining and more restrictive over time. Likewise, there's no thought given to a regulation here and what unintended consequences play out through the economy. So, we have this in America too. This is not a European unique problem. I would note that we now have had fuel economy standards for, trying to gain fuel efficiency in automobiles for 50 years. And the best-selling vehicle in the United States is a big pickup truck, a Ford F-150. So one of these things, at some point, you got to step back and say, did we do anything here? That is, I think, the place that Europe is in with a number of their regulatory initiatives. They tend to stretch the envelope of what's possible. They put a lot of strain on business in terms of competitiveness. And it's not clear that it's achieving what they set out to achieve anyway.
Bill?
I agree in part, and I think disagree in part. I think that they're going to have more success with the first mover regulatory advantage than Scott thinks. Maybe not here anymore. During the Biden administration, there were a good number of people, both in the administration and in Congress, who admired what the Europeans were doing, particularly in the digital area, and wanted to replicate it here. That is more or less disappeared, I think, in the Trump administration, although it may be back. But that's actually not the most important thing. What companies all over the world are realizing, including American companies, is that if you want to do business in Europe, you've got to conform to their regulatory requirements. That's the way it works. I mean, if you want to do business in the United States, it's the same thing. So they have all these regulations. We'll be talking about the corporate sustainability one in a few minutes, but they have the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act. They have the privacy regulation, which is probably the one that's affected the most parties. And if you want to do business there, you're going to have to meet those standards. And in the absence of competing standards here, that becomes a default position. And Trump can complain about that all he wants. And Vance can complain about it all he wants, and he has. But from the company's perspective, if they want to do business in Europe, they're going to have to deal with it. And it doesn't really matter what the United States position is unless we can persuade them to change course. Now, your question began with the hint that maybe they are changing course a little bit. This regulatory package is designed to address the criticism that some of the things they've done have been too burdensome and too onerous and have been a drag on growth. And the Draghi report really says that explicitly. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. It sounds like what they are talking about are tweaks rather than fundamental change. I mean, tweaks are welcome, but they're still tweaks. And we've talked about this before. The fundamental problem, I think, grows out of Europe's affection for the precautionary principle, which is primarily seen in food and agriculture, but not only there. And in essence, it's a principle that says if you can't prove it safe, then you can't do it. The U.S. position tends to be more or less the opposite. It's okay to do it until we decide it's unsafe. And I think you can make a good case, and I think Draghi alludes to this indirectly, that the European approach stifles innovation and the U.S. approach does not. Now, the other side will argue maybe, but there are downsides that the U.S. approach produces. It may be more dangerous. It may produce more carcinogenic chemicals. It may produce lower health and safety standards. It may produce unsafe food. This is my famous chicken argument that I will not repeat for the 8th time on the podcast.
Oh, come on. You're going to bum us out if you don't do the chicken thing.
I'm not going to do the chicken story, no. But the point is that there's a fundamental divide here between the way the EU regulates and really the way most other people regulate or fail to regulate. The U.S. problem is that we haven't proposed a credible alternative in most of these areas. And what we've got here now are states, individual states, taking on the burden of proposing credible alternatives. And of course, they're not all doing the same thing, which is a headache for business because they have then multiple standards that they have to adhere to. Not only the European one, but in the case of privacy, I think now there's 7 or 8 different states that have passed separate and not entirely identical privacy rules that companies have to watch out for. It's a mess. I think tweaking won't fix it, but it's a cultural problem. The European approach is we want you to be safe, we want you to be healthy, and we're going to set up regulations that make sure you are. And that's expensive and innovation deterring.
Well, if I could just defend American product safety here for a moment, we do have a very high standard. The standard is reasonable certainty of no harm. And when applied to consumer products and food products, reasonable certainty of no harm delivers about the same safety levels in market as anything in Europe. In other words, we do not experience higher fatalities here. We do have a lot more additives in the food that we use that have not made it through the process in Europe. There are definitely differences, but the U.S. standard is fairly high. It is not the precautionary principle where you're trying to essentially prove negatives about everything. And so there is a difference, but first, I want to tell our listeners that the trade guys don't think American food and products are unsafe.
No, we do not. We consume plenty of it.
And we consume them. All you have to do is take a look. But correcting Bill on that point, I would agree with Bill that on privacy, Europe managed a regulation in the first instance called GDPR, which was adopted as an international standard simply because there was no alternative. So the first mover advantage did work on GDPR. The question is, how far into the future will it work? And is that good for Europeans and everybody else?
Well, to give the Europeans some credit, they've become kind of a prisoner of the European Court of Justice because every time they've produced a privacy regulation, their arrangement with the United States has been challenged in the European judicial system. the way that that particular regulation works is that the EU wants to be satisfied that the other country is providing appropriate privacy protection for private data in that country, particularly data of Europeans that might be held in that country. And if they are satisfied that the country is doing that, then basically the EU gives them a seal of approval, and that allows data to flow more freely. The EU has not granted that seal of approval to the United States because of concerns that U.S. intelligence authorities are able to access private data of individuals without the consent of the individuals, which is not permitted by the GDPR. And the United States has been either unable or unwilling or both to generally provide enough assurances to satisfy the European court system. We have now, I think, 3 times made a deal with the European Commission on how that would work. And each time the Commission has pronounced itself satisfied with the arrangement, in which I think the latest arrangement creates an independent or ostensibly independent government body that will review data requests from the intelligence authorities. But each time, I mean, the third one is pending. We don't have an answer yet, but the previous 2 times, the courts in Europe have slapped that down and said that it does not accurately, fully and completely meet the standards of the GDPR. There's an Austrian activist who brings these cases. His name is Schrems. And so we had Schrems 1 and Schrems 2, and we are now on Schrems 3, and we will wait to see what the court say about that one. I rather expect that the United States will lose again, and then we'll go on to Schrems 4. And this may go on indefinitely. Each one buys time, but it doesn't solve the problem. But in the meantime, I think what you're going to see happening is more and more companies trying to figure out ways to do business in ways that are consistent with European regulation. And if the United States had its own federal privacy regulation, we'd be in a much better position to bargain with them. But we don't, so we're not.
Yeah. So let's talk about the American industries that are actually exposed to EU regulation. What are they, guys?
Well, the privacy regulations probably most directly affect the platform technology companies, Google, Facebook, X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. Those are the sort of the frontline issues because they are the online marketplace where all these activities occur, and they tend to generate the most attention, and regulation tends to be focused there. But product regulations go out throughout all industries, food and agriculture, as well as normal consumer and industrial products.
The big guys tend to be more affected than the small guys.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these regulations don't apply to smaller entities. In fact, with respect to the newest one, which is not fully in effect yet, is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, unfortunately an unpronounceable acronym, which creates a due diligence responsibility to identify and address human rights and environmental impacts in companies' operations and in their subsidiaries and upstream and downstream in their value chains. And they also are required to put in a transition plan for climate change mitigation that is consistent with the Paris Agreement. So that is bound to raise Trump's ire, I think. And that plan has to cover all their operations and their suppliers and their partners, set emission reduction targets, outline the investment and funding necessary to accomplish all that, and be updated annually. There are significant reporting requirements. Now, this particular regulation has been criticized on many grounds. Apropos to your question, the left complains that it's not strong enough because it leaves out, by virtue of size, more than 2/3 of European companies. Inevitably, it's the big guys that get hit. If you look at the Digital Acts, the Digital Markets Act, and the Digital Services Act, both cases are premised on the idea of creating, basically, in the DMA case, identifying gatekeepers, which are the big companies like Google, Meta, and I think now 6 out of 8 of them, I believe, now are Americans. They've added a couple Chinese. And the Digital Services Act, the same thing, Meta and Microsoft and companies like that. So it's the big guys that have the most onerous responsibility. And there, of course, it's primarily in the digital space, although in some cases, we're talking not just about platforms like Google or, well, Google is probably the best one, or Apple, but we're also talking about cloud service providers and service providers like Amazon, also Alibaba, but also Amazon-like companies like Temu and Nishian, the two Chinese companies. One is fast fashion and one is a provider of a whole range of products. And they've, I think, at least in the Temu case, have reached the threshold of number of people clicking on them and using their services to qualify for the very large status that would subject them to EU coverage. So mostly the big guys.
Now, imagine you are the chief executive of Nestle, a fine Swiss company that sells chocolate products throughout Europe. Well, chocolate is made from cocoa, and there are probably 10,000 cocoa farmers in North Africa that supply cocoa beans to Nestle. Developing sustainability plans and human rights measures for those 10,000 cocoa farmers is quite the challenge that I don't think anybody in Brussels has really thought through what the scope of these demands are for the regulations.
Yeah, that's the issue that's come up. As I said, the CSDDD has been criticized from the left as not covering enough. Predictably, the right criticizes it for covering too much, and in particular doing exactly what Scott was talking about, requiring companies basically to assume responsibility for their suppliers, including all those cocoa bean suppliers that he referred to, and to do that extraterritorially, because they are foreign nationals of a different country, suppliers in a different country. So it reflects non-European upstream suppliers indirectly, as well as large non-European companies directly. And it effectively makes European companies liable for damage caused by the actions of others, namely their suppliers or people in their supply chain, rather than limiting civil liability in Europe to the violations that they engage in, either intentionally or through gross negligence. So it's a very far-reaching rule. The United States actually has something that is, unless Trump has abolished it in the last 2 or 3 days, roughly similar, except that it's a voluntary set of standards and not a rule. It's the National Action Plan on Responsible Business Conduct. But, when it's a voluntary standard, that's one thing. When it's a mandatory requirement that has extensive reporting requirements, it's something much different. And that's why there's been a chorus of complaint about it. And it's also why I think you'll see it featured, reforms will be featured in this regulatory package that's coming up. They've already postponed the effective date of it. I mean, it has multiple effective dates depending upon size of company. So if you're more than 5,000 employees and more than 1.5 billion euros worldwide turnover, you have up until basically 15 more months, more than that, July 26, 2027 to comply. Smaller companies have an extra year or an extra 2 years to comply. And that is, in fact, a retreat already because the original compliance dates were a year earlier than that. So the trend, I think, in Europe is to lose some patience with the EU's regulatory approach, I think aided by the Draghi report, which focused on this as a real deterrent to further innovation in Europe. And I think focused on the consequences of some of these things that are starting to become real as opposed to abstract. The CBAM, for example, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure, is in effect now as far as reporting is concerned. So there's an administrative burden. But a year from now, 10 months from now, starting in 2026, companies are actually going to have to start paying to equalize if they have excess carbon content on their imports. At that point, you're going to see a chorus of complaints, I think, that is just now beginning. And as consumers realize that this is going to increase the cost of products, you're seeing some decline in enthusiasm in Europe for this kind of regulation. We'll see how far the Commission is willing to go to correct that. My guess is, going back to what I said before, tweaks and not fundamental change.
That's really unfortunate. You're probably right, Bill. But in my mind, Europe is kind of dead in the water from a productivity growth standpoint. They're really having a terrible time retaining innovators and entrepreneurs. Most of the successful European innovators are living and working in the United States because that's where there's the capacity, the ability to innovate. It is too stifling an environment, and if they don't change it, they'll become less competitive and poorer over time. There was a meme that circulated this weekend about a German ship that was a brand new ship about to be launched, and they used the EU-approved champagne bottle holder when they tried to break the bottle of champagne on the hull of this brand new ship as it was launched for good luck. And the EU regulation made sure that no one was injured because the bottle of champagne would not break. It literally fell out of the approved holder rather than break against the hull of the ship. So that's overregulation in a nutshell.
There you go.
I find that very reassuring. It means my champagne bottle is not going to explode.
Yes, but they missed the plot somewhere.
All right, Bill, I know you've been chomping at the bit to talk about this, but the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDD, what is it and why do we care about it?
Yeah, I've already talked about that. I've snuck that in several different times. It's their newest regulation, which is designed to promote exactly what it says, sustainability and due diligence amongst not only European companies. I think the thing that I didn't make adequately clear before is this is an extraterritorial regulation. It applies to companies doing business in Europe and their suppliers. So it works its way upstream. It also affects American companies that are selling products in Europe or have a physical presence in Europe. It's one of these things that's problematic because it's based on a number of UN covenants that are all good things: worker rights, fair wages, good safety and health requirements, equal pay, non-discrimination, the right to form unions and strike. Most people, there may be exceptions in the current American administration, but most people don't want to stand up and say those are bad things. Those are good things. But the extent to which companies have to develop plans for compliance, the extent to which they have to report annually on their plans for compliance, including their climate change mitigation provisions, because that's one of the regulation, and the fact that they have to do that not only for themselves, but for their suppliers, the other parties of their supply chain, and they have to do it extraterritorially, makes it a very, very broad regulation that sucks in a large number of people, none of whom is willing to say this is a bad idea, but many of whom are not really in a position to take on the responsibilities that they're tasked with of reporting or complying with some of the standards. And the result is, if this is implemented, as it stands, there may be a lot of litigation and regulatory filings in the EU over, individual cases. In this particular case, the directive is enforced by the member states. It's not enforced by the Commission. So that's going to increase the vagueness of it even more because you're going to get variable enforcement patterns. Some countries will be very aggressive and go after, everybody that doesn't file the report letter perfect on time. And other countries will probably be much laxer, but you won't know that until it's operated for a few years. It's going to be a mess, basically. And, we'll see what happens. I would expect this new package that's coming out is going to address some of the criteria. One of the complaints is kind of ironic because one of the complaints is that it's too vague. It doesn't give companies enough direction about exactly what they're supposed to do to achieve all these various goals or remedy these various problems. That's ironic because most of these other regs are criticized because they're too specific and they're too prescriptive. Do it this way and you'll be okay. Don't do it this way and you're going to have a problem. In this case, it's the other way around. They have not provided enough guidance. And so there appear to be quite a number of people that are upset about it, both European companies and American companies. So we will see how it develops. But it's one more piece along with the digital regulations, along with GDPR, along with their GMO regulations that are basically, I think, handcuffing Europe's ability to innovate.
The Europeans have not reached out to the trade guys for assistance in this particular initiative. And who knows, maybe they will. But
if they know what's good for them, they will.
If I were to give them one piece of advice, I'm thinking back to a project I worked with Bill when he was the head of the National Foreign Trade Council, who worked on economic sanctions.
He was a big shot then, wasn't he?
He was. And
no more.
He was El Jefe, of the association. But one of the things we had in our reform package was a sunset clause, which is that if you had sanctions in place at a certain interval, like 5 or 10 years, Congress had to reconsider whether to continue them. And I think in a lot of regulatory initiatives that Europe has proposed, probably meaning well, perhaps doing some good, regulations get old, they get unproductive, and they start to drag down the economy. Maybe a sunset clause is something they should consider.
Do I smell consulting contract here, Scott?
Well, you never know.
Maybe something for the trade guys here. We can go into a side business.
Let's hang out the shingle.
It's fun either way, but since nobody asked, I thought I'd tell them what I'd do.
I love it.
While we're on the subject of Europe, we should add just a brief word about what's impending, which are tariffs. And there, I think, there seems to be sort of a victim of the week. And we've gone through Canada, Mexico, China, Colombia. I have a feeling that Europe is on the short list for victimhood. He seems to have a boatload of grievances against the Europeans, including most of the ones we've just been talking about. Vice President Vance discussed a number of these regulations in his speech at the AI summit in Paris last week, and Trump has on occasion lashed out against the Europeans as well. So I think for those of you that follow the tariff issue closely, and we'll have more to say about tariffs in the future without question, I would look at, Europe being relatively high on the victim list. And in contrast to some of the others, the one place where I think they might be more inclined to retaliate and take a tougher line. So one more thing to complicate everybody's life.
Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Boys, thank you. We will be back next week, same time, same trade channel, and we'll talk more about the Europeans and all kinds of cool stuff. We're in the age of tariff, man.
Indeed.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.